Jordan Shaver was only 21, but she appeared to have everything.
A Hummer and a boat.
BMWs and Porsches. All this cash.
And the pretty girl who was once poor and isolated was suddenly very popular.
You're just drawn to her.
We almost moved in with her.
The booze was unlimited. The pizza was unlimited. The marijuana was unlimited.
But when local millionaire Brian Geddes went missing,
we knew something was wrong.
Everyone would be asking questions about his attractive young house guest.
I always told him, you need to find somebody your age.
He's like, who are all of you people? Why are you at my dad's house?
I was like, what the hell is going on?
And how far she would go to live the good life.
Sometimes you just want something so bad that there's nothing that can stop you.
On November 2nd, 2012, a woman named Megan Go contacted the authorities in Garden City, Idaho, concerned about her father, 50-year-old Brian Geddes.
She was saying that she hasn't seen her father in a couple weeks.
The last time I actually talked to my dad, I was in such a rush, and I kind of pushed him away, I gotta go, Dad. I'm really, really busy.
Megan was still feeling guilty when she tried to call her dad 3 days later on his birthday.
I called him 3 times from work on his birthday, and he never answered. And then I texted him. He never texted me back.
She hadn't been able to get a hold of him.
But then, a few days after that,
and I finally got a text back from my dad's phone.
According to the text, the self-made millionaire was in Jackpot, Nevada, a casino town 3 hours south of Boise. But that seemed out of character for Brian.
I'm like, it's not my dad.
He's not a big gambler. He wasn't frivolous with his money.
My dad would never, ever go to Jackpot.
Even stranger, when Megan tried to call him back, her father didn't answer.
He would always have a text message of an excuse of why he couldn't talk with her.
I just can't call right now. I don't have any service. I'm walking into the casino.
And that made Megan even more suspicious.
My dad would never blow me off. Never.
Especially around his birthday. And after those first few texts claiming he was in Jackpot, her father had stopped responding to her at all.
That kind of upset her, and that, why won't you talk to me?
Something inside me was telling me, something's wrong. Something's really wrong.
She wasn't hysterical, but she was obviously concerned about her father.
And by November 2nd, after almost 3 weeks with no word from her father, Megan had become so concerned that she and her brother had gone looking for him at his home outside Boise. And as soon as they pulled up, they both knew that something was wrong.
It was a complete disaster. It was disgusting. My dad's house is always perfect, proper condition. And then you walk in, and it was just trashed.
But according to what Megan told the police, the real shock came when they knocked on their father's front door and someone else answered. A mysterious young woman named Jordan Shaver.
She had nowhere else to go, so she and Brian came to an agreement that she could live there and provide rent and just be roommates at that time.
And Brian's family suspected that 21-year-old Jordan was the key to finding their missing father. Born in 1991, Idaho native Jordan Shaver grew up poor.
She came from nothing. No money, no wealth.
And things got even worse after her parents divorced when she was still a little girl.
She didn't have a lot of support growing up as a child.
After the divorce, Jordan's mother remarried, but the family remained poor, living in a rundown Boise suburb called Nampa.
It's lower income. There's a lot of mobile homes and a fairly high crime rate.
Although as a child, Jordan seemed blissfully unaware of just how tough her circumstances were.
She was super bubbly. She was really upbeat, she was really outgoing, and she wanted to do everything,
And in elementary school, the bubbly, innocent 10-year-old developed a crush on one of the boys in her class, Burke Gamblin.
He came from a wealthy family, had money, looked good, had nice things.
Burke didn't know about her crush, at least not at first.
I went to her birthday party. We were 10 years old. And she made a birthday wish that she could give me a kiss.
Put on the spot, Burke rejected Jordan.
I had my first kiss with her best friend.
And as she grew older, Jordan came to understand why boys like Burke rejected her.
She was what society would consider trailer trash.
Painfully aware of the gap between her family's poverty and her wealthier classmates, by high school, the bubbly, innocent girl had grown into a rebellious teen.
She had a tattoo on her chest. She always was dyeing her hair different colors.
And she and Burke, the boy she had a grade school crush on, stuck with their separate social circles.
We still went to the same school, but we didn't really hang out.
In 2009, they would drift even further apart. Jordan and Burke both graduated from high school, and considering that he came from a well-off family, it was no surprise that Burke was soon busy building his future.
I was going through real estate school at the time, and so, I was taking all these tests and studying.
And he hadn't thought of Jordan in years. In fact, he'd all but forgotten she existed. That is, until he checked Facebook one night in September of 2012.
At first I was like, why is this guy Jordan liking all my photos?
But then, when he took a closer look, he realized just who Jordan was and how much she had changed.
She's gorgeous. She really is. She just kind of grew into herself.
And apparently her looks weren't all that had changed either. At least that's what Jordan said once she and Burke started chatting online.
And I was like, what are you up to? And she goes, I just bought a house on the river.
According to Jordan, she'd worked hard after high school, and at only 21, she was well on her way to putting her hard-scrabble past behind her.
Well, she said she was a loan officer at a bank.
Impressed, Burke asked Jordan if she wanted to get together sometime. And considering her grade school crush, it was no surprise that she immediately accepted.
I just had a lunch break, and I went to the mall, and she was like, hey, I'm at the mall too, and so we just met up.
At the mall that afternoon, Burke quickly realized that the years hadn't changed Jordan much. She still had the same bubbly, up-for-anything attitude she'd had as a child.
Halloween was in a month and a half. She's like, let's go try on costumes, And so we went and tried on these Halloween costumes, and she looked pretty cute. It was like, oh.
You couldn't not love her.
The second you meet her, you're just drawn to her.
And within days of reconnecting, the pair was inseparable.
We just immediately, start talking every day and wanting to hang out every day.
Most of the time, they hung out at Burke's apartment.
She actually, would come over and help me study because I was like, I have to study. And she's like, I'll come over and help you study. And of course, we wouldn't really study.
And when they weren't studying, the pair was often out partying with friends.
We'd go over to her friend's house all the time, and we'd always have these places that we could go.
She was always wanted to meet new people, just loved everybody.
However, there was one place they didn't hang out. Jordan's new house by the river.
You're just like, hey, we ever gonna go to the house that, you mentioned? And she's just, I didn't want to have to tell you this, but she said that her mom was going through chemo, and she didn't want me to see her mom like that.
Burke decided to let the issue drop.
I was almost assuming it's maybe the house doesn't exist.
Not that he really cared. In early October, after they'd been dating a few weeks, he took Jordan home to meet his family.
She was really nervous about meeting his mom.
Not that she needed to worry.
My family liked her.
There were signs that Jordan was getting more serious about Burke, too. One afternoon in mid-October, he got a surprising text from Jordan.
She's like, well, why don't you come over to my house and get in my hot tub? This is the first time that she's invited me over to the house.
And when Burke pulled up to the address that Jordan gave him, he stopped doubting her place by the river and started envying it.
I was like, this is your house? You know, like, this looks like my family's house. Like, this looks like retirement.
Technically, the house was a trailer, but it was far from trashy.
It had a little hot tub in the back, a patio deck that was covered out the back up next to the green belt, and very well manicured.
Inside, it was well furnished, too.
75-inch TVs and like vanilla couches and these big Persian rugs.
The inside of the house was just like, holy.
And the same was true of the cars filling the driveway.
There's all these cars, just like BMWs and Hummers, Porsches.
Burke was shocked. How on earth could a 21-year-old like Jordan afford all of this?
She didn't come from a very wealthy family.
Where's all this money coming from?
The answer Jordan gave was that her father, years after divorcing her mother, was suddenly back in her life.
She said her dad was a millionaire and that her dad wasn't able to give her the childhood that he wanted to when she was younger, and so now he gives her all he can.
According to Jordan, that had included the money to buy the place by the river, complete with the furniture and cars from a very motivated seller. Coming up, Jordan's new house becomes party central.
We almost like moved in with her.
But just whose house are they moving into?
She goes, that's what your girlfriend told us, but we don't believe her.
By the end of October 2012, 21-year-old Jordan Shaver had finally gotten what she'd always wanted. Burke Gamblin, the boy she'd had a crush on since elementary school.
They had a super awesome relationship. Like, they were really good together. Like, he treated her really nice.
Not only that, Jordan had apparently moved well beyond her poor upbringing in the Boise, Idaho suburb of Nampa.
She has all these cars, all this cash.
She had like a Hummer and a boat and all these other things.
The 21-year-old lived in a well-appointed home overlooking the beautiful Boise River.
There's a huge flat screen TV and like there's a glass table and like really nice couches.
And it was just like, all of a sudden she just had all this stuff.
And considering how poor she'd been previously, back when she and Burke were in high school, Jordan's sudden success had given him a moment's pause.
Kind of, put on my guard.
How do you automatically just come up with so much money to buy a house when you came from nothing?
According to Jordan, the answer was complicated. First off, she had recently landed a good job as a loan officer at a local bank.
She said like she was like really high up and she was making a lot of money.
Jordan also said that her father, who'd been out of her life for years after her parents' divorce, was back, and that he was determined to make up for his long absence.
She tells me, my dad helped me buy the house and everything.
Most of all, though, Jordan said that she had simply gotten a good deal on the house, the cars, everything.
She's like, I bought the house as a package deal from a guy who had to go to Europe to take care of his sick parents.
And that had been all the explanation Burke and the rest of Jordan's friends needed.
I believed her.
These kids were her age. They were young adults. They're not going to ask a lot of questions.
I was just like, good for you. Like, have a way better start than any other 20-year-old I know.
Jordan's friends would have ample opportunity to see just how well she was doing, too. Once she had invited Burke over for a night in her hot tub, Jordan's house became the preferred party destination for all their friends.
We all turned 21 at that time, so we're drinking, hanging out.
And not only did she have the perfect place, Jordan was a generous host.
The booze was unlimited. The pizza was unlimited. The marijuana was unlimited.
She also bought quite a bit of ecstasy. $1,000 worth of ecstasy or $3,000, something just like a ton.
Money like basically wasn't a thing to her.
And by the end of October, as word of Jordan's generosity spread, the parties got bigger and wilder.
We almost moved in with her. We would party over there, just whatever.
After a few weeks of dating, Burke did move in. But the more time he spent with Jordan and the more she partied, the more he started to realize that something seemed off about his new girlfriend.
She never went to work.
Jordan, once again, had a ready answer.
She said that she was on paid vacation.
In the back of their mind, they knew it wasn't adding up, but they were enjoying themselves. They were more into having the beer, having the drugs, having the pizzas, having a place to party, having a place to sit in a jacuzzi hot tub.
Although for his part, Burke was starting to wonder whether or not Jordan was telling him the whole truth.
It was like, she has all these cars, all this cash, she's gorgeous, she's a porn star, right? That's what I thought.
Porn star or not, Burke didn't want to ruin a good thing, so he decided not to press the issue.
I was like, don't ruin it over some petty lie, possibly, maybe she can't tell me the truth or something, I don't know. Maybe the truth would hurt too bad or something.
Burke didn't know it, but he was at least half right. The truth would hurt, although Jordan's lies were far from petty. The first real indication that something was going on came at the end of October, when Burke spotted the elderly couple who lived next door unloading groceries from their car. Worried that the neighbors might be upset with the loud parties, Burke decided to introduce himself in an effort to make peace.
So I, came up to the neighbors. Hey, my name's Burke.
The reception he got wasn't friendly, particularly from the elderly woman.
She just was glaring at me.
But when she spoke, it wasn't to complain about the noise. Instead, she said something that left Burke confused.
She's like, where's Brian?
And when Burke told the woman that he didn't know anyone named Brian,
she's like, you don't know the owner of the house you're living in.
At first, Burke figured that it had to be some sort of mistake.
I was like, are you talking about the guy that, Jordan bought the house from that had to go to Europe? And she goes, yeah, that's what your girlfriend told us too. But we don't believe her.
Burke was shaken by the neighbor's statement.
I was just weirded out. I was like, what the hell is going on?
But when he spoke to Jordan, she had what sounded like a reasonable explanation.
These neighbors, she's like, they have Alzheimer's.
She would always have a story. There was always some excuse.
According to Jordan, Burke had it right. Brian was the former owner of the house. But when he sold the house and moved to Europe, the sudden change had confused his elderly neighbors.
She's like, I've probably met him 6 or 7 times. They hardly remember me.
Once again, Burke let it go.
I was like, this is a good relationship, and I don't want to ruin it by just an overactive imagination. I'm like, I love her.
And it was clear Jordan felt the same way about him.
She was madly in love with him.
But the next strange incident at the house would be far harder for Jordan to explain. On November 2nd, Jordan and Burke were both out, but her friend Nastasia Rain and several other friends were hanging out at the house when a strange man suddenly walked in the back door.
We're like, what are you doing? This isn't your house. Why even Jordan's house?
His answer, which was really more of a question, took Nastasia by surprise.
He's like, why are you in my dad's house?
The man told Nastasia and her friends that his father, Brian Geddes, owned the house. What's more, he claimed that he hadn't heard from his father in nearly 3 weeks.
He's pissed. He's furious. He's like, who are all of you people?
And the mystery man's anger only increased when Jordan showed up at the house a few minutes later.
He's like, where's my dad? And she's like, oh, he's still celebrating his birthday in Nevada. And he's like, no, I don't believe you.
Jordan refused to back down, however, leading to an awkward impasse.
It was kind of just one of those whatever moments, and he leaves.
The strange incident had ended peacefully, but it clearly left Jordan rattled.
She was freaking out, hardcore. She was really scared.
She wasn't afraid that the angry stranger would return. Jordan was apparently afraid he would go to the authorities.
And I was like, why? Like, why would he?
After all, what could Jordan possibly have to hide? Coming up, the missing man's daughter confronts Jordan.
She said, "Get out of my house."
And the investigators get closer to the truth.
We decided to do a phone trace on Brian's cell phone.
On the afternoon of November 2nd, 2012, the Garden City, Idaho police received a worried call from a woman named Megan Go. Her father, a local businessman named Brian Geddes, had been missing since his birthday in mid-October.
She hadn't heard from him for some time, and just the circumstances made her worried about his welfare and where he was at.
There would be times where we wouldn't physically see each other for a week or so, but we always talked. It would have been his 50th birthday.
Even more troubling, when her brother had gone over to their father's house earlier that day. He had found the place trashed and full of strangers.
She was dealing with strangers in his house that shouldn't have been there. So she was pretty worried about him and just really wanted answers at that time.
And according to what Megan told the police, she had gone over to the house seeking answers from the young woman at the center of the mystery, 21-year-old Jordan Shaver. Jordan had met Brian a little more than 2 months earlier, at the end of August, on the walking trail that ran behind his riverfront home.
She was out walking her dog, and she came upon Brian and met him.
But according to what Brian told his daughter, their casual acquaintance had turned serious a few nights later, when Jordan showed up unannounced on his doorstep.
He called me and he said, "Hey, this girl showed up at my house." And when I opened the door, she was covered in blood.
According to what Jordan told Brian, her abusive boyfriend had just kicked her out of their apartment.
They were having some domestic issues.
She went into detail about, he beat me up and now I have nowhere to go.
Brian had immediately called the police.
I had responded to Brian's house with Jordan there.
And he had even offered Jordan a place to stay temporarily.
My dad's nature would be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. What can I do?"
He's a softie that way. He would do that. He loved beautiful women. Can't blame him.
But unbeknownst to Megan, temporarily had turned into something more long-term. In late September, several weeks after she showed up on Brian's doorstep, Jordan was still there.
When I first saw her, I didn't know that it was the same girl, that had been there a month ago. She was sitting in one of his lawn chairs on the back patio with him, and they were smoking cigarettes.
Megan cautioned her dad to be careful about spending time with Jordan, just in case.
I told him numerous times, you don't need to be friends with somebody that young. I always told him, you need to find somebody your age.
Though Brian claimed that they were just friends.
He never told me that they were dating. He never told me anything like that. He just told me they were friends.
And she had to admit that for a young woman looking for support, her dad made a tempting target. Brian Geddes' money was self-made. Out of work in the 1980s, he'd used a $600 unemployment check to buy a used car, the first of many that he would buy and resell for a profit.
This car business, he built it from absolute scratch.
Flipping them, buying and selling, and ended up being really successful.
As his money grew, so did his business ventures.
Along with the car business, he was into real estate and owned homes, rented them all out, made money that way.
And by the time Jordan had turned up on his doorstep, the 49-year-old entrepreneur was coasting towards an early retirement.
He was making a couple million a year.
He had everything. All of it. He had it all.
Including his most prized possession, his riverfront home.
It's literally what we would call his oasis. He was obsessed with it.
So where was he? And why had Jordan been telling people he'd sold it to her? That's what Megan had wanted to know after her brother called her on November 2nd.
My brother told me, hey, I just stopped by Dad's house and there's, some teenagers up there. and there's some girl driving his car.
Megan immediately met up with her brother and returned to the house, looking for some answers. Instead, they found Jordan, who had apparently forgotten who Megan was.
She said, who are you? Get out of my house.
And when Megan explained who they were and who they were looking for,
we asked her, where's our dad? Her whole demeanor changed in an instant. Just went from very angry and confrontational in our faces to, oh my gosh.
In fact, according to Megan, Jordan was so panicked that she bolted out the door.
Jordan takes off
down the riverfront walking trail that ran behind the house.
And that's when I called the police.
She didn't chase after Jordan or anything else like that. She stayed at the scene waiting for police to help her, trying to find her father.
When the first officers arrived on the scene, Megan let them know she hadn't seen her father in almost 3 weeks.
She relayed to us that she was getting these text messages that she didn't believe that were supposedly from her father, but that she did not believe that were from him.
It wasn't his lingo. And so I started catching on to, this is not my dad texting.
And when the officers went inside the house with Megan, its condition was yet another indication that Brian had apparently been gone for some time.
It was very dirty, food left out, things were being in disarray. I knew from past calls that he kept his house very clean, very put together.
But did a dirty house and the fact that Jordan had fled mean something sinister had occurred? For the moment, the police couldn't be sure.
He was a grown-up adult and didn't need to tell where he was at.
So unwilling to jeopardize the investigation, they backed off and secured the house until they obtained the necessary warrants for a thorough search.
There's cop cars and vans and tape and people everywhere. It's just a very chaotic scene.
While waiting on the warrants, the investigators first focused on ruling out the possibility that Brian was where his supposed text messages said he was, just over the state line in Jackpot, Nevada.
I contacted some casinos in Jackpot to confirm that he wasn't in Jackpot, called the hospitals, make sure that he wasn't sick or injured.
And when those inquiries proved to be a dead end,
we decided to do a phone trace on Brian's cell phone.
Although it appeared to be a toss-up whether that would lead them to Brian or Jordan.
The police suspected that Miss Shaver was using the cell phone of Mr. Geddes.
Whoever had the phone, they hadn't gone far.
We had it pinged in the area of State and Glenwood. It stayed pretty stable of that location.
A shopping center that was a little bit farther north of the home.
Within minutes, police converged on the shopping center.
They kind of focused their attention on that location, just getting manpower to that location.
But they didn't find the missing man.
They did find Jordan.
She had his phone.
And she didn't want to be found.
She was hiding in a vehicle in the Walmart parking lot. She was trying to hide in the vehicle and trying to act like she didn't see the officers, didn't hear the officers.
Once it was clear there was no escape, Jordan went peacefully.
There was no struggle, there was no fight or anything. She went with officers pretty well.
Although, for the time being, they didn't place her under arrest.
I told Jordan right off the bat, Jordan, I don't know what's going on other than that somebody came over and called the cops about their missing father. Take me through it. What is going on?
Jordan appeared willing to cooperate. And what she told the investigators in the interrogation room was essentially a variation of what she had previously told her boyfriend, Burke.
She and Brian came to an agreement that she could live there, and if she stayed there, he could go travel more. And meantime, while he was gone, she would take care of the house, take care of the dog, take care of his cars.
However, she also added a new wrinkle. In the interrogation room, Jordan told the police that she was worried about Brian, too.
She opens up and says she's scared.
And when the investigators asked Jordan why she was scared,
she goes on and continues, well, I think Brian is dealing in drugs.
She did have like a good amount of drugs with her. So, I mean, if that story is true, then that would make sense.
The police were dubious, though. As far as they knew, Brian was an upstanding businessman. But they did let Jordan continue just to see where her story would lead.
What she eventually tells us is that she met a drug dealer of Brian's a while back, where she went to the Walmart and watched Brian get out of the car and get into the drug dealer's car, and then eventually return with a bag of marijuana.
Then Jordan claimed that the drug deal had gone bad.
She talked about how Brian said he was scared of the drug dealer and feared for his life.
Coming up, Burke tries to coax the truth out of Jordan.
I felt insane.
And Jordan changes her story once more.
She told me that she freaked out. She didn't know what to do.
On November 2nd, 2012, Jordan Shaver sat in a police interrogation room in Garden City, Idaho. The 21-year-old was at the center of the mysterious disappearance of a successful local businessman named Brian Geddes.
The children reported their dad missing and said it just didn't seem right what answers they were being given.
Even more suspicious, Jordan had been living in Geddes' house for the past several weeks.
She started having friends over and a boyfriend and parties.
And she'd been telling those friends that the self-made millionaire had sold her the house.
There were several different stories about where he was. One of them was that he was in Jackpot, another that he was in Europe. Different stories to different people.
We trusted her, and we believed that, what she was saying was true.
But the authorities weren't so sure. Earlier that day, after finding that Jordan had possession of the missing man's cell phone, they had brought her in for questioning.
We didn't have the answers, but we knew something was wrong.
And the sense that something horrible had happened to Brian only deepened in Jordan's interview. She told the investigators that Brian was involved with drug dealers and that he had been in fear for his life.
When she told me the story of the drug dealer, that's about the point where I realized something's wrong. Something's wrong with Brian, and we need to get to the bottom of it.
That didn't mean they believed Jordan, though. For starters, if she thought Brian had been in danger, why hadn't she gone to the police? The answer, according to Jordan, was a frightening incident that occurred a few days after his disappearance.
She tells me that she was confronted by the drug dealer. He puts a gun to her head and tells her that if she says anything, her family would be killed, including all her friends.
Once again, the investigators were skeptical.
If you've been confronted by a drug dealer with a gun at the residence, why are you staying there? Why are you continuing to have parties there?
But when pressed by the investigators, Jordan stood her ground.
She said she had a feeling that the drug dealer did something to Brian.
There was no evidence that Brian had ever been involved in drugs. However, the investigators did have an ace in the hole, something they thought just might cause Jordan to crack. Her boyfriend, Burke Gamblin. The police had brought Burke in for questioning not long after they picked up Jordan.
He did not know what was going on, and he was extremely worried.
Although when the police explained what was going on and what they suspected, Burke's worry turned to dismay.
Right at that moment, I felt insane. I felt like I was in a dream.
He liked her a lot, and he was in shock.
I'm like wearing his jacket and like driving his cars, like living in his house. It's just like so messed up.
He was very forthcoming with the detectives and very helpful, and he was willing to talk with us and help us out.
And there was one specific favor the investigators wanted.
They said, we want you to go and talk to her, and they said, we want you to just tell her to tell the truth.
When Burke stepped into the room, the effect on Jordan was instantaneous.
She, jumps up, gives me a hug.
But then he told her it was time to come clean.
I'm just like, tell the truth.
Burke's ultimatum had an immediate effect on Jordan.
There was a lot of emotion, a lot of crying.
And once the investigators pulled Burke out of the interview room, it became obvious that Jordan had finally cracked.
She asked me, "Can I hold your hand?" And at that time, I knew that's when we were going to get something good that we wanted.
Whether it was entirely true or not. According to Jordan, she had been alone with Brian on the evening of October 16th, roughly the time that he had disappeared.
She told me that there was a night, the night of before Brian's birthday, 50th birthday, that they were in his bed and she was giving him a massage. And at that time, she was talking to him about a gun that she just acquired.
Although according to Jordan, the gun wasn't working properly, at least not for her.
She was having a hard time manipulating the gun.
Jordan said that Brian had asked to see it, and after racking a few shells through the action, he had declared that the gun was fine. But according to Jordan, Brian had been horribly wrong.
It accidentally went off while he was handing the gun back to her.
She told me that she freaked out. She didn't know what to do, and she wanted to call 911 but couldn't bring herself to doing so.
Instead, Jordan said that she had left Brian on the bed and driven to a nearby shopping center, the Walmart where she would later be picked up by the police.
She buys a lot of things that she needed, things that made her feel good. Makeup, clothing, bras, underwear, some items for the house.
And then, when she was done,
she bought a tarp while she was at the Walmart. And when she returned home, she told me that she rolled Brian up in it and pulled him off the bed.
So where was Brian? Incredibly, he was still in the home he called his oasis, or at least under it.
She cuts the skirting to the trailer and is able to slide Brian under that location and put the skirting back into place.
The body is in the crawl space the whole time.
After weeks of maintaining that he was still alive, Jordan had finally admitted that Brian was dead.
She kept saying that she was sorry and that she was not a bad person. She didn't mean to do it.
But was she telling the whole truth? Later that night, they returned to Brian's trailer, still cordoned off with crime scene tape.
His body was recovered underneath the trailer.
That wasn't all the investigators found either.
The gun was found under the bed within the master bedroom where Brian slept.
And just as Jordan said, the evidence suggested that the bed she had been sleeping in with Burke was also where Brian died.
Some of the blood dripped through the mattress.
A 12 by 12 inch circle of blood the whole way down.
But if Jordan was telling the truth about that, what about her claim that Brian's death had been an accident, the result of a fatal misfire? Brian's autopsy provided the answer.
Mr. Geddes was shot in the back of the head.
It was never determined whether it was a head contact wound or not, but it was a definitely wound to the back of the head.
Coming up, Jordan faces murder charges.
I'm sick and disgusted with myself and my actions.
But will Brian's family be disgusted with the outcome?
I didn't want her getting off with manslaughter.
On December 18, 2013, Jordan Shaver stood before a judge in a Boise, Idaho courtroom. The 22-year-old had been charged with the October 2012 murder of Brian Geddes.
He was shot in the back of the head and he was put under his house.
She lived in his home for about 3 weeks after the murder, used his car, just acted like nothing was amiss.
Brian had taken her in a few months earlier, and for a girl who'd grown up with nothing, his lifestyle appealed to her.
She wanted to feel rich. She wanted to impress people.
Sometimes you just want something so bad that there's nothing that can stop you.
And according to the authorities, Jordan had wanted to impress her friends so badly that on the evening of October 16, 2012, she had even resorted to murder.
She told me she owned the house a month before she killed him. And it's almost maybe like she said it and then she just made a lie, try to make it come true.
There was no bank job, no motivated seller. She'd simply been using a dead man's estate to convince Burke and her friends that she was wealthy and successful.
And that was very, very important to Jordan, to be this new kid on the block that had the money, that had the toys. That was the place to go hang out. And that was what kept her going. But she couldn't keep it going. The stories, the lies came to an end.
The end came in court that morning. On December 18, 2013, Jordan pleaded guilty to second-degree murder.
She knew she wasn't going to get off.
Although Jordan had initially been charged with first-degree murder, Brian's family had agreed to the plea deal rather than risk a jury trial.
I didn't want her getting off with manslaughter.
At her sentencing, Jordan took full responsibility for Brian's death.
I'm sick and disgusted with myself and my actions.
But she also asked for his family's forgiveness.
I will never stop praying that maybe one day you could find it in your heart to forgive me.
She will be in for a long wait.
I don't forgive her. I don't know if I ever will.
One thing's for certain, though. Once the judge handed down her sentence, Jordan would have a long time to contemplate what she did.
I will sentence Ms. Shaver to the custody of the Board of Correction for a term of life.
She will be eligible for parole, though, in 20 years. But if she hopes to someday reconnect with Burke a second time, she's bound to be disappointed.
You don't want to believe that anybody you love could do something like that.
On the afternoon of May 23rd, 1992, the Sicilian sky was clear. Traffic flowed normally along the A29 motorway that connected Palermo to Punta Resi Airport. Families were returning home. Travelers moved between cities. To anyone looking from a distance, it was an ordinary Saturday. But beneath a stretch of highway near the small town of Capaci, hidden inside a drainage tunnel, hundreds of kilograms of explosives waited in silence. The people driving above had no idea, and neither did most of Italy. At approximately 5:58 p.m., a convoy of armored vehicles traveled along the motorway after leaving the airport. Inside one of those vehicles was a man who had spent years fighting one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Europe. His name was Giovanni Falcone. For more than a decade, Falcone had become a symbol of resistance against the Sicilian mafia. To many citizens, he represented courage. To his colleagues, he represented persistence. To the organization known as Cosa Nostra, he represented something else entirely. A threat. Not because he carried a weapon, not because he commanded an army, but because he understood them. He understood how money moved through their networks. He understood how drug trafficking connected Sicily to the wider world. He understood the hidden structure behind the violence. Most importantly, he understood that the mafia was not merely a collection of criminals committing isolated acts. It was an organized system, a system with leadership, rules, finances, and influence. For years, many people had feared that system. Falcone chose to challenge it. Now, as his convoy moved across the Sicilian landscape, others were watching. Not from another vehicle, not from a police checkpoint, but from a hillside overlooking the motorway. There, a group of men waited. Among them was Giovanni Brusca. In his hands was a remote-control detonator. The operation had not been arranged overnight. It had not been planned in anger after a sudden disagreement. It was the result of careful preparation, surveillance, and calculation. The men responsible had spent weeks studying routes, schedules, timing, and security procedures. They knew which road Falcone usually took after landing in Palermo. They knew where his convoy would travel. They knew approximately how fast the vehicles moved. And they believed that on this day, after years of conflict with the Italian justice system, they finally had their opportunity. Brusca looked through binoculars. The convoy approached. Seconds passed. The vehicles drew closer to the selected location. Then came the moment. A single press of a button. An instant that lasted less than a second. And yet that instant would change Italy forever. The explosion that followed was enormous. The motorway erupted. Concrete shattered. Steel twisted. Earth exploded upward into the air. A section of highway was torn apart with such force that it resembled the aftermath of a military strike rather than a criminal attack. The lead vehicle in the convoy was devastated. Debris flew across the roadway. The shockwave traveled far beyond the immediate scene. The blast was so powerful that seismic instruments in the region recorded it. Within moments, what had been an ordinary stretch of road became a landscape of destruction. Smoke filled the air. Vehicles were mangled. Survivors struggled to understand what had happened. Emergency responders rushed toward a scene that looked less like an accident and more like a battlefield. News began spreading. At first, fragments of information emerged. An explosion. A convoy. Possible casualties. Then came the name. Giovanni Falcone. Across Sicily, people stared at television screens. Across Italy, journalists interrupted programming. Within hours, the country understood that something extraordinary had occurred. This was not simply the murder of a public official. This was not simply another mafia killing. This was something larger, something bolder, something that seemed to cross an invisible line. For years, organized crime had existed in the shadows, influencing communities, businesses, and institutions. Violence was not new. Murders were not new. Intimidation was not new. But this attack was different. It took place in broad daylight. It used an enormous quantity of explosives. It targeted one of the most recognizable anti-mafia figures in the country. And it unfolded on a public highway. The message seemed unmistakable. Those responsible wanted the world to see what they had done. They wanted the state to understand that they were willing to challenge it openly. And for a brief moment, it appeared as though they had succeeded. As emergency crews worked desperately amid the wreckage, uncertainty surrounded the fate of those inside the convoy. Some victims had been killed instantly. Others fought for survival. The destruction was overwhelming. The attack had been executed with extraordinary precision. Yet, while the physical damage was immediately visible, the deeper consequences would take longer to emerge. Because the bombing at Capaci was not merely an act of violence. It was the culmination of a war that had been building for years. A war between a criminal organization determined to preserve its power and a group of investigators, judges, and prosecutors determined to dismantle it. To understand why Giovanni Falcone became a target, we must go back before the explosion, before the smoke, before the shattered highway, before the funerals. We must return to a period when many Italians viewed the mafia as untouchable. We must return to the years when fear often silenced witnesses and discouraged investigations. We must return to the rise of a judge who refused to accept that organized crime was invincible. Because the story of Capaci did not begin in 1992. It began much earlier. It began with a simple but dangerous idea that even the most powerful criminal organization could be exposed. That evidence could defeat intimidation. That financial records could reveal secrets hidden behind violence. And that the law, if pursued with enough determination, could challenge an empire built on fear. For Giovanni Falcone, those beliefs defined his career. For Cosa Nostra, they made him an enemy. The road to Capaci was not measured only in kilometers. It was measured in years of investigations, years of testimony, years of courtroom battles, years of threats, years of conflict between a judge and an organization that had grown accustomed to operating beyond accountability. The explosion on the motorway was the moment the world noticed. But the story itself had already been unfolding for a long time. And in many ways, the bomb beneath the highway was not the beginning of this case. It was the final move in a struggle that had transformed Sicily. A struggle whose consequences would echo far beyond the crater left behind on that road. In the years that followed, many would remember the image of the destroyed motorway. The broken concrete, the smoke, the devastation. But another image would prove equally powerful. The image of a man who had spent his career pursuing the truth despite knowing the risks. A man whose enemies believed that killing him would protect their future. A man whose death would ultimately help trigger events that neither they nor anyone else could fully predict. This is the story of the Capaci massacre. The story of Giovanni Falcone. The story of the Sicilian Mafia's most audacious attack. And the story of how one explosion shook an entire nation. Long before the explosion at Capaci tore apart a section of highway and shocked an entire nation, there was a man whose name had become synonymous with one of the most difficult battles in modern Italian history. Giovanni Falcone was not a politician. He was not a military commander. He did not lead a movement or command crowds from public stages. He was a magistrate, a judge whose primary weapons were evidence, testimony, financial records, and an unwavering belief that organized crime could be understood, exposed, and ultimately challenged through the law. To understand why Cosa Nostra decided to kill him, it is necessary to understand who he was and why his work represented such a profound threat to the organization. Giovanni Falcone was born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1939. Sicily was not simply the place where he lived. It was the environment that shaped the conflict that would define his career. By the time Falcone entered public service, organized crime had already established deep roots across parts of Sicilian society. The influence of Cosa Nostra extended far beyond acts of violence. It touched business, politics, local communities, and everyday life. For many people, the organization appeared permanent. It was feared, respected by some, and often regarded as something that could never truly be defeated. Throughout the years, countless investigators have pursued individual crimes linked to mafia activity. Murders were investigated. Suspects were identified. Arrests were sometimes made. Yet the larger structure often remained intact. Even when individual members were imprisoned, the organization itself continued to function. Falcone gradually became convinced that this approach was insufficient. Rather than viewing mafia crimes as separate incidents, he began examining them as parts of a larger system. This distinction may sound simple, but it fundamentally changed the way investigations were conducted. Instead of asking only who committed a specific murder, Falcone asked broader questions. Who benefited financially? How was money transferred? Which relationships connected criminals across different regions? How did orders move through the organization? What structures allowed criminal operations to continue despite arrests and prosecutions? These questions led him into areas that previous investigations had often overlooked. He followed financial transactions. He studied drug trafficking networks. He examined hidden bank accounts. He traced connections between Sicily and criminal organizations operating abroad, including networks linked to the United States. The deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. Cosa Nostra was not merely a loose collection of violent men. It was an organized criminal system. The significance of this realization cannot be overstated. If the organization operated as a system, then it could potentially be investigated as a system. Instead of pursuing isolated offenders, prosecutors could attempt to expose the entire structure. This idea would eventually transform Italy's fight against organized crime. But developing such a strategy required evidence. And evidence arrived from an unexpected source. One of the most important developments in Falcone's career came through information provided by Tommaso Buscetta, a former mafia insider who chose to cooperate with authorities. For years, much of the public understanding of Cosa Nostra had been fragmented. Many people knew the organization existed, but few possessed a complete picture of how it functioned internally. Buscetta's testimony helped change that. Through his cooperation, investigators gained unprecedented insight into the structure of the organization. For Falcone, the information was invaluable. Buscetta's testimony helped reveal relationships, hierarchies, and operational methods that had previously remained hidden. It provided a framework that allowed investigators to connect countless individual pieces of evidence into a larger narrative. The significance of this development extended far beyond a single witness statement. It allowed Falcone to demonstrate that Cosa Nostra was not a myth, not an exaggeration, and not a collection of unrelated criminals. It was a structured criminal organization with identifiable leadership and coordinated activities. As his investigations expanded, Falcone developed a reputation unlike that of many public officials. Supporters viewed him as courageous. Critics sometimes viewed him as relentless. But even among his enemies, there was growing recognition that he posed a unique danger. Unlike investigators who focused on visible violence, Falcone pursued the foundations of the organization itself. He sought to understand how power functioned, and once he understood it, he attempted to dismantle it. During these years, another figure emerged alongside him, Paolo Borsellino. The two men would become closely associated in the public imagination, not only because they worked in the same field, but because they shared a common mission. Both dedicated themselves to combating organized crime. Both understood the risks. Both became symbols of resistance against mafia influence. Over time, their names became inseparable from Italy's anti-mafia struggle. Together, they represented a challenge unlike any Cosa Nostra had previously faced. As investigations progressed and evidence accumulated, an extraordinary opportunity emerged. Authorities believed they finally possessed enough information to bring a large portion of the organization before the courts. The result would become one of the most significant legal proceedings in modern Italian history. It became known as the Maxi Trial. The very scale of the proceeding reflected the magnitude of the challenge facing the Italian justice system. This was not a trial involving a handful of defendants. It was an attempt to prosecute an entire criminal structure. The courtroom itself became a symbol of the seriousness of the undertaking. Security concerns were immense. The defendants were numerous. The stakes were enormous. Inside this specially secured environment, hundreds of accused mafia members faced prosecution. A total of 475 defendants were brought before the court. Hundreds of lawyers participated. Thousands of pages of evidence were presented. Witness testimony, investigative findings, and years of accumulated information were placed before the judicial system. For the prosecution, the trial represented an unprecedented opportunity. For Cosa Nostra, it represented an unprecedented threat. The proceedings demonstrated something that many people had previously considered impossible. The organization could be challenged openly. Its members could be identified. Its activities could be documented. its leadership could be held accountable. The trial attracted enormous public attention. Citizens followed developments closely. Journalists reported extensively. The outcome carried implications far beyond the courtroom itself. If the prosecution failed, confidence in the state's ability to confront organized crime could be severely damaged. If the prosecution succeeded, it could fundamentally alter the balance of power between the state and Cosa Nostra. Eventually, the results became clear. Many powerful mafia figures were convicted. The organization suffered a devastating legal defeat. For years, Cosa Nostra had cultivated an image of strength and inevitability. The Maxi trial challenged that image directly. For supporters of Falcone, the outcome represented validation of years of work. For the mafia, it represented humiliation. And humiliation can be a powerful motivator. The convictions did more than remove individuals from the streets. They demonstrated that the organization's internal structure could be exposed. That realization carried consequences. Within Cosa Nostra, resentment grew. Falcone was no longer simply a judge performing his duties. He had become a symbol. To many mafia leaders, he embodied everything they feared. He had helped transform scattered investigations into a coordinated legal offensive. He had contributed to a trial that damaged the organization's prestige. He had proven that the state could strike at the heart of their power. As a result, his status within the eyes of the mafia changed. He increasingly became viewed as the principal enemy, the man responsible for one of the greatest setbacks in the organization's history. Yet despite the success of the Maxi trial, the conflict was not over. The legal process continued. Appeals remained possible. Convictions still required final confirmation. For a time, uncertainty lingered. Would the verdict survive? Would the years of work ultimately hold? The answer arrived in January 1992. Italy's Supreme Court upheld the major convictions from the Maxi trial. The decision carried enormous significance. What had once been allegations became confirmed judgments. What had once been legal victories became permanent legal realities. For Falcone and those who had worked alongside him, the ruling represented the culmination of years of effort. For Cosa Nostra, it represented something else entirely. Final defeat, at least in that chapter of the struggle. The ruling eliminated many remaining hopes that the organization could reverse the outcome through the courts. The humiliation became official. The consequences became unavoidable. Within the leadership of Cosa Nostra, anger intensified. Among those paying close attention was Salvatore Riina. Riina occupied a position of immense influence within the organization. The convictions represented not only legal losses, but direct challenges to mafia authority. From the perspective of leadership, a response was required. The decision that followed would shape the course of Italian history. According to the information later established through investigations and prosecutions, Riina concluded that Giovanni Falcone had to be eliminated. The logic behind the decision was brutally simple. Falcone had become too dangerous, too effective, too symbolic. His work had demonstrated that organized crime could be confronted successfully. As long as he remained active, he represented a continuing threat. The decision marked a turning point. Until then, the conflict between Falcone and Cosa Nostra had largely unfolded through investigations, evidence, arrests, and courtroom proceedings. Now the organization chose a different path. A path that would ultimately lead to one of the most notorious acts of mafia violence in European history. The order was given. The target was selected. And somewhere beyond public view, preparations slowly began. The battle that had started with investigations and testimony was moving toward its final and most violent chapter. Giovanni Falcone could not know precisely when or where an attack would come. But by 1992, he understood the reality of the danger. His work had challenged powerful interests. His successes had inflicted unprecedented damage upon a criminal empire. The conflict had become deeply personal for those who viewed him as their enemy. Yet despite the risks, the investigations had continued. The prosecutions had continued. And the legal victories had continued. What nobody yet knew was that a group of men were about to begin planning an operation unlike anything Italy had seen before. An operation that would require surveillance, explosives, patience, and absolute precision. An operation designed not merely to kill a judge, but to send a message to an entire country. The road to Capaci was now beginning. And the people who intended to carry out the attack believed that history was about to turn in their favor. By early 1992, the conflict between Giovanni Falcone and Cosa Nostra had reached a point from which neither side could retreat. For years, Falcone had helped expose the internal structure of the Sicilian mafia. He had contributed to investigations that followed financial networks, connected criminal operations, and transformed fragmented evidence into a comprehensive picture of organized crime. The Maxi trial had become the most visible result of that work. Hundreds of defendants had been prosecuted. Powerful figures had been convicted. Then, in January 1992, Italy's Supreme Court upheld the major convictions. For Falcone and his colleagues, the ruling represented a historic victory. For Cosa Nostra, it represented humiliation. Inside the organization, the decision was interpreted not merely as a legal defeat, but as a direct attack on its authority. The convictions demonstrated that the state could challenge the mafia at a scale previously considered impossible. Years of effort had culminated in a result that threatened both the organization's power and its reputation. According to later investigations, the response from the leadership of Cosa Nostra was decisive. Giovanni Falcone had to be eliminated. The order was attributed to Salvatore Riina, the organization's most powerful leader. Once the decision had been made, attention shifted to the practical question of how such an operation could be carried out. The target was one of the most protected individuals in Italy. Falcone traveled under heavy security. He moved with escorts. His routes were monitored. Any assassination attempt would require extraordinary preparation. The responsibility for organizing the operation fell to Giovanni Brusca. Even within mafia circles, Brusca's reputation was one of extreme violence. Years later, he would admit his direct involvement in the attack. At the time, however, his task was straightforward in theory and extraordinarily difficult in practice. He needed to find a way to kill Giovanni Falcone despite the extensive security surrounding him. The planning process began with observation. Before an attack could be carried out, the assassins needed information. They studied Falcone's movements carefully. His schedule became a subject of attention. His travel patterns were analyzed. His routines were examined for vulnerabilities. Investigators would later determine that members of the operation spent considerable time gathering intelligence about his movements between Rome and Palermo. One detail proved especially important. Falcone frequently traveled by air between the Italian capital and Sicily. When he arrived at Punta Raisi Airport near Palermo, he generally followed the same route into the city. The route was predictable, and predictability creates opportunity. The assassins focused their attention on the A29 motorway. The highway connected the airport to Palermo and passed through an area near the town of Capaci. The road itself appeared unremarkable. Thousands of vehicles used it. Nothing about it suggested that it would become the location of one of the most infamous attacks in European criminal history. Yet for the planners of the assassination, it offered several advantages. Most importantly, they believed they could strike from below. Near Capaci, a drainage tunnel ran beneath the motorway. The location presented a possibility that conventional attacks could not. Rather than attacking the convoy directly with firearms or explosives placed beside the road, they could conceal a massive explosive charge underneath the highway itself. The idea transformed the operation. Instead of attempting to overcome armored vehicles through direct assault, they would destroy the road beneath them. The next phase involved preparation. According to later findings, approximately 400 to 500 kilograms of explosives were assembled and placed inside the drainage tunnel. The material included TNT, Semtex, and other military-grade explosives. The quantity alone demonstrated the scale of the operation. This was not a simple bombing. It was an attempt to unleash overwhelming force. Moving such a large amount of explosive material required planning and secrecy. The operation unfolded largely at night. Members of the conspiracy transported the explosives into the tunnel beneath the motorway. Piece by piece, the attack took shape. But placing the explosives was only part of the challenge. The bomb would be useless if detonated too early or too late. Precision became essential. The conspirators conducted measurements. They calculated distances. They studied traffic patterns. They estimated vehicle speeds. They tested equipment. They selected observation points from which they could monitor the approaching convoy. Every aspect of the operation depended upon timing. If the explosion occurred a few seconds too soon, Falcone might survive. If it occurred a few seconds too late, the target could pass unharmed. Weeks of preparation were devoted to ensuring that the detonation could be triggered at exactly the right moment. The level of planning resembled a military operation more than a conventional criminal act. Nothing was left to chance if it could be controlled. As the preparations continued, Giovanni Falcone carried on with his professional responsibilities. There is no indication within the known facts provided that he knew exactly when the attack would occur. The danger surrounding him was well understood. The risk of retaliation from organized crime had long been a reality. Yet life continued. Investigations continued. Travel continued. Security procedures continued. Meanwhile, beneath the motorway near Capassi, the bomb waited. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, the date arrived. Saturday, May 23rd, 1992. For the conspirators, this was the day everything would be tested. Months of preparation would either succeed or fail. For Falcone and those traveling with him, it appeared to be another return trip to Sicily. Earlier that day, Giovanni Falcone and his wife, Francesca Morvillo, traveled from Rome to Palermo. Morvillo was herself a magistrate. Together, they arrived at Pontaresi Airport. Waiting nearby was the security convoy assigned to protect them. Protection had become an unavoidable part of Falcone's life. The threat against him was too serious to ignore. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles. Each played a specific role. The first vehicle carried members of the escort detail. Among them were Antonio Montanaro, Vito Scafani, and Rocco DiCillo. Their responsibility was to help ensure the safety of those traveling behind them. The second vehicle carried Giovanni Falcone and Francesca Morvillo. Also present was Giuseppe Costanza. One detail would later attract attention. On that afternoon, Falcone himself was driving the armored Fiat Croma. The third vehicle carried additional security personnel. Together, the convoy departed the airport and entered the motorway. The journey toward Palermo began. The road stretched ahead. Traffic moved normally. Nothing visible suggested that disaster was approaching. Yet several kilometers away, hidden from sight, the assassins were already in position. Giovanni Brusca occupied an observation point on a hillside overlooking the motorway. From there, he possessed a clear view of the target area. Binoculars allowed him to monitor approaching vehicles. communication equipment connected him with others involved in the operation. Most importantly, he possessed control of the detonator. The entire plan now depended upon a few seconds of judgment. The convoy approached. The distance narrowed. Vehicle after vehicle moved closer to the hidden explosives beneath the highway. Ruska watched. The lead vehicle entered the designated area. The second vehicle followed. Years later, accounts of the bombing would focus on this moment because everything that followed happened almost instantly. At approximately 5:58 p.m., Ruska activated the detonator. The result was catastrophic. An enormous explosion erupted beneath the motorway. The force tore through concrete and earth. A section of highway was ripped apart. Massive pieces of debris were thrown into the air. The blast carved a huge crater into the roadway. Witnesses later described a scene of extraordinary destruction. The explosion was so powerful that local seismic instruments recorded the shockwave. For a brief moment, the motorway ceased to resemble a road at all. Instead, it resembled a battlefield. The lead vehicle absorbed the full force of the explosion. The devastation was immediate. Antonio Montanaro, Vito Scafani, and Rocco DiCillo were killed instantly. There was no opportunity for escape. No opportunity for reaction. The explosion had occurred with overwhelming force. Behind them, the second vehicle carrying Falcone and Morvillo encountered the aftermath. The road ahead had effectively disappeared. Debris covered the motorway. The armored Fiat Croma crashed violently into the destruction created by the blast. The impact was severe. Falcone suffered catastrophic injuries. Reports later described multiple traumatic injuries, including severe head trauma and extensive internal damage. Francesca Morvillo was also critically injured. The violence of the collision transformed the vehicle into a wreck. Within moments, what had begun as a routine journey became a struggle for survival. The third vehicle in the convoy escaped complete destruction, but not the chaos that followed. Security personnel rushed toward the scene. Dust filled the air. Smoke rose above the motorway. Broken concrete littered the landscape. The scale of the devastation made immediate assessment difficult. Survivors attempted to understand what had happened. The attack had unfolded in seconds. Yet its consequences were still emerging. Emergency services were alerted. Rescue efforts began. The wounded required immediate medical attention. Among those most critically injured were Giovanni Falcone and Francesca Morvillo. Every minute mattered. Falcone was transported by helicopter to a hospital in Palermo. Doctors fought to save his life. Medical teams worked under intense pressure. The injuries, however, were devastating. Despite emergency treatment, the damage proved too severe. Hours after the attack, Giovanni Falcone died. He was 53 years old. Francesca Morvillo also succumbed to her injuries. The toll of the attack continued to grow. By the end of the day, 5 people had lost their lives. Giovanni Falcone, Francesca Morvillo, Antonio Montanaro, Vito Scafani, Rocco DiCillo. 23 additional people were injured. For the survivors, the physical and emotional consequences would endure long after the explosion itself. As darkness fell over Sicily, news of the attack spread rapidly. Television networks interrupted programming. Journalists rushed to gather information. Citizens across Italy struggled to comprehend the scale of what had occurred. The images emerging from Capaci seemed almost unbelievable. A major highway had been destroyed. A prominent magistrate had been assassinated. Security officers had been killed. The attack had occurred in broad daylight. The destruction was visible to the entire country. The message was unmistakable. Cosa Nostra had not attempted to hide. It had staged one of the most audacious attacks in modern European criminal history. Yet, while the perpetrators may have believed they had demonstrated their strength, the events of May 23, 1992, would ultimately trigger consequences far beyond the immediate success of the assassination. At that moment, however, none of those future developments were visible. All that remained was devastation. A shattered motorway, 5 dead, 23 injured, and a nation beginning to realize that the war between the mafia and the Italian state had entered a new and terrifying phase. When the dust began to settle over the A29 motorway on the evening of May 23, 1992, Italy was confronted with a reality that was both horrifying and impossible to ignore. The attack at Capaci was not merely another mafia murder. It was not a shooting carried out in a dark alley. It was not a disappearance hidden from public view. The destruction was visible from the sky. A major highway had been ripped apart by hundreds of kilograms of explosives. 5 people were dead. 23 more were injured. One of the country's most recognizable anti-mafia magistrates had been assassinated. The violence was so extreme that it seemed designed not only to kill, but also to send a message. As television networks interrupted normal programming and journalists rushed to the scene, investigators faced an enormous task. They needed to determine exactly how the attack had been carried out. They needed to identify everyone involved. And they needed to understand whether the bombing represented an isolated act or part of something larger. In the immediate aftermath, emergency services focused on rescue operations and securing the area. The motorway had been transformed into a massive crime scene. Broken concrete covered the road. Damaged vehicles remained scattered across the site. Fragments of evidence were buried beneath debris and earth. Before investigators could begin answering questions, they first needed to document the destruction itself. One fact became apparent almost immediately. This attack had required extraordinary preparation. The crater left in the motorway demonstrated the enormous force of the explosion. The amount of explosive material involved could not have been assembled casually, nor could it have been placed beneath the road without planning. The bombing was not the work of a single individual acting impulsively. It was the result of a coordinated operation. As investigators examined the scene, they began reconstructing what had happened. The damaged roadway revealed that the explosives had been positioned beneath the highway rather than beside it. This discovery was significant. The attackers had not relied upon a roadside bomb. Instead, they had chosen a drainage tunnel beneath the motorway. From a tactical perspective, the location offered clear advantages. The explosives could remain concealed. The blast would strike directly beneath the convoy, and the attack could be initiated remotely. The more investigators analyzed the evidence, the clearer the planning became. Whoever organized the bombing had studied the target carefully. The operation depended on knowing where Giovanni Falcone would travel. It depended on knowing when he would arrive. It depended on understanding the route taken from Puntaresi Airport into Palermo. Every element suggested surveillance. Every element suggested preparation. The investigation therefore expanded beyond the physical evidence left behind by the explosion. Authorities began examining the movements of the victims. Travel schedules became important. Convoy procedures became important. Known threats against Falcone became important. Gradually, a picture emerged. The bombing had not targeted a random vehicle. It had targeted Giovanni Falcone specifically. This conclusion may seem obvious today, but in the early stages of any major investigation, conclusions must be supported by evidence. Investigators therefore worked methodically. The attack occurred on a route Falcone regularly used. The timing corresponded with his arrival from Rome. The location had been selected with precision. The explosives had been positioned in advance. The detonation had occurred at the exact moment the convoy entered the target zone. Every detail pointed toward a carefully planned assassination. Attention quickly turned toward the most likely perpetrators. For years, Falcone had dedicated his career to fighting Cosa Nostra. The organization had suffered major legal defeats as a result of investigations and prosecutions he helped lead. Most importantly, the Supreme Court had recently upheld the major convictions from the Maxi trial. That ruling represented one of the most devastating blows in the history of the Sicilian Mafia. As investigators considered motives, Cosa Nostra immediately became the primary focus. The organization possessed the capability. The organization possessed the motive. And the organization possessed a long history of violence against those it viewed as threats. The attack at Capaci therefore appeared not as an isolated act, but as the continuation of a conflict that had been unfolding for years. As evidence accumulated, authorities increasingly viewed the bombing as a direct assault on the Italian state itself. This distinction mattered. Falcone was not simply a private citizen. He was a magistrate whose work symbolized the state's effort to combat organized crime. An attack against him, therefore, carried broader implications. It challenged public institutions. It challenged the justice system. And it challenged the state's authority. Across Italy, reactions reflected this understanding. Citizens watched news coverage with shock. Political leaders issued statements. Public anger intensified. The scale of the bombing made it impossible to dismiss. Even individuals who had previously viewed mafia violence as a distant problem now found themselves confronted by images of a destroyed highway and murdered public servants. In Palermo, the emotional impact was particularly intense. The city had long existed in the shadow of organized crime. Residents were familiar with violence. They were familiar with intimidation. Yet Capaci felt different. The attack seemed to represent an escalation. A declaration that Cosa Nostra was willing to employ extraordinary violence in broad daylight against one of the most protected figures in the country. For investigators, this public reaction created additional pressure. The country demanded answers. The country demanded accountability. The country demanded action. Yet before those demands could be satisfied, another tragedy occurred. Only 57 days after the Capaci massacre, violence struck again. On July 19, 1992, another bombing exploded in Palermo. The target this time was Paolo Borsellino. Like Falcone, Borsellino had dedicated his career to fighting organized crime. Like Falcone, he had become one of the most visible figures in Italy's anti-mafia movement. And like Falcone, he had become a target. The bombing occurred on Via D'Amelio. When the explosion ended, Paolo Borsellino and 5 members of his escort team were dead. The significance of this second attack cannot be overstated. Until that moment, some observers may have hoped that Capaci represented a singular act of retaliation. The murder of Borsellino destroyed that possibility. Investigators now faced evidence of a coordinated campaign. 2 of Italy's most prominent anti-mafia magistrates had been assassinated within less than 2 months. The pattern was unmistakable. The killings were connected by motive. They were connected by targets. And they were connected by the broader conflict between Cosa Nostra and the Italian state. The second bombing became one of the most important turning points in the investigation. It confirmed that authorities were confronting an organization willing to wage open war. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino were no longer viewed as separate crimes. Together, they formed part of a larger strategy. A strategy intended to intimidate institutions and preserve mafia power. Instead, the attacks produced an effect that the perpetrators may not have anticipated. Public outrage intensified dramatically. In Palermo, citizens gathered to express anger and grief. Demonstrations emerged. Anti-mafia sentiment became increasingly visible. Many people who had previously remained silent now spoke openly. The murders transformed public perception. For years, organized crime had often been viewed as a deeply rooted but difficult to confront reality. Now the violence was impossible to ignore. The deaths of Falcone and Borsellino personalized the struggle. Citizens no longer saw abstract legal proceedings. They saw human consequences. They saw judges murdered. They saw police officers killed. They saw families grieving. The emotional response spread throughout the country. News coverage amplified public awareness. Political pressure increased. The demand for decisive action became overwhelming. From an investigative standpoint, this shift in public sentiment proved crucial. Major criminal investigations do not occur in isolation. Resources matter. Political support matters. Public cooperation matters. The bombings created momentum for a larger response. Authorities increasingly recognized that traditional approaches would be insufficient. The challenge required a broader strategy. The attacks had demonstrated the capabilities of Cosa Nostra. Now the state needed to demonstrate its own resolve. As investigators continued reconstructing the Capaci bombing, several conclusions became increasingly clear. First, the attack had required extensive surveillance. The perpetrators knew Falcone's travel patterns. Second, the attack had required substantial logistical preparation. Hundreds of kilograms of explosives had been assembled and transported. Third, the attack had required coordination. The operation involved planning, observation, and remote detonation. Finally, the attack reflected decision-making at a high level. The bombing was too significant to represent the initiative of a minor criminal. Investigators therefore focused attention on the leadership of Cosa Nostra. The search for responsibility extended beyond those who physically carried out the attack. Authorities sought to identify those who planned it, those who approved it, and those who ordered it. This broader investigative approach reflected lessons that Falcone himself had spent years teaching. Individual acts of violence could not be fully understood without understanding the system behind them. The bombing at Capaci was not merely an explosion. It was the product of an organization with leadership, structure, and objectives. As months passed, the investigation increasingly moved in that direction. The focus expanded beyond the crime scene, beyond the detonator, beyond the explosives, toward the network that made the attack possible. By the end of 1992, one reality had become impossible to deny. The murders of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino had transformed Italy. The bombings exposed the scale of the threat posed by organized crime. They revealed the lengths to which Cosa Nostra was willing to go in order to protect itself. And they convinced much of the nation that the struggle against the mafia could no longer remain limited to a handful of magistrates and investigators. It had become a national issue, a national challenge. And soon, that challenge would trigger one of the largest anti-mafia crackdowns in Italian history. The investigation that began amid the rubble of Capaci was no longer simply about solving a murder. It was becoming part of a larger effort to confront the organization responsible, an effort that would eventually reach some of the most powerful figures within Cosa Nostra itself. The explosions at Capaci on May 23, 1992, and later at Via d'Amelio on July 19, 1992, marked a turning point in Italy's confrontation with organized crime. What had previously been a long, complex judicial struggle suddenly transformed into a national crisis. The killings of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino did not silence the anti-mafia state. apparatus. Instead, they activated it on a scale previously unseen in Italian history. In the immediate aftermath, the Italian state found itself under extraordinary pressure. The brutality of the attacks had crossed a threshold that shocked the public conscience. These were not hidden crimes. These were public executions of two of the country's most respected magistrates, carried out with military-grade explosives on open roads and in city streets. The message from Cosa Nostra was intended to be one of intimidation, but the effect would ultimately move in the opposite direction. The government responded by launching one of the largest anti-mafia operations ever conducted in Italy. Law enforcement agencies, magistrates, and investigative units were rapidly mobilized. The priority was no longer limited to solving individual cases. The objective became dismantling the organizational structure responsible for the killings. Investigators began widening their focus beyond the immediate perpetrators of the Capaci bombing. While Giovanni Brusca had been identified as the operational figure responsible for the detonation, authorities understood that he was not acting alone. The scale of planning required for the attack made it clear that decisions had been made at higher levels within Cosa Nostra. Attention turned toward the leadership structure of the organization, particularly the most powerful figures believed to have authorized the killings. At the center of this focus was Salvatore Riina, widely regarded as the dominant boss of Cosa Nostra during this period. According to investigative findings and later judicial conclusions, Riina had ordered the elimination of Giovanni Falcone following the confirmation of major convictions in the Maxi trial earlier in 1992. The Maxi trial itself remained a central reference point in all subsequent legal actions. It had resulted in the prosecution of 475 defendants, extensive documentation of mafia operations, and the conviction of numerous high-ranking members of Cosa Nostra. The Supreme Court's decision in January 1992 to uphold these convictions had removed any remaining legal hope for reversal. From the perspective of the mafia leadership, this represented a final and irreversible defeat in the judicial arena. It was within this context that the decision to escalate violence was made. The assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino were not isolated reactions. They were part of a broader strategic shift by Cosa Nostra toward direct confrontation with the Italian state. However, this escalation triggered consequences that the organization did not fully anticipate. Public reaction in Italy was immediate and intense. The deaths of Falcone and his escort officers were broadcast nationwide. Images of the destroyed highway at Capaci, the wreckage of armored vehicles, and the devastation of Via d'Amelio circulated widely. The emotional impact was profound. For many Italians, the reality of mafia violence was no longer abstract. It was now visible, undeniable, and deeply personal. Large-scale demonstrations began to appear in Palermo and other cities. Citizens who had previously remained silent or disengaged began expressing open anger toward Cosa Nostra. The assassinations had crossed a psychological boundary in public perception. The mafia was no longer seen only as a hidden criminal organization operating in the shadows. It was now recognized as an entity capable of waging open war against the state. This shift in public sentiment created a political environment in which strong action became unavoidable. The Italian government, responding to both public pressure and institutional necessity, intensified its anti-mafia strategy. Security operations were expanded. Arrest campaigns were initiated. Intelligence efforts were strengthened. The objective was no longer containment. It was systematic dismantling. One of the key targets of this expanded effort was the leadership of Cosa Nostra itself. Investigations increasingly focused on identifying, locating, and capturing those responsible for ordering the assassinations. The chain of command behind Capassi and Via D'Amelio became a central line of inquiry. Within this context, law enforcement agencies pursued extensive intelligence operations across Sicily and beyond. Surveillance networks were strengthened. Informants were cultivated. Financial investigations were expanded to trace the movement of resources within the organization. Every available tool was deployed in an effort to penetrate the structure of Cosa Nostra. The turning point came in January 1993, when Salvatore Riina was arrested after more than 2 decades as a fugitive. His capture represented a significant symbolic and operational blow to the organization. Riina was widely regarded as one of the most powerful and influential bosses in Cosa Nostra's history. His leadership had been associated with a period of extreme violence, including the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino. Following his arrest, Riina faced multiple trials and was sentenced to several life terms in prison. These convictions were directly linked to his role in authorizing and overseeing major acts of mafia violence, including the Capassi bombing. The arrest of Riina marked a critical moment in the broader collapse of Cosa Nostra's operational dominance. While the organization itself did not disappear, its leadership structure was significantly disrupted. The loss of its most influential figure created instability within its internal hierarchy. At the same time, further developments in the investigation continued to reshape the judicial understanding of the Capassi attack. One of the most significant figures to emerge in this phase was Giovanni Brusca, the man responsible for triggering the explosion. Brusca was arrested in 1996 after years of evasion. His capture provided investigators with access to first-hand operational details of the assassination. In subsequent proceedings, he admitted his role in the bombing and confirmed key aspects of its execution, including surveillance, preparation, and the use of a remote detonation system. Brusca's cooperation with authorities represented a major development in the broader investigation. As a direct participant in the operation, his testimony helped confirm the mechanics of the attack and the involvement of higher-level decision-makers within Cosa Nostra. His statements contributed to the judicial reconstruction of how the Capassi massacre had been planned and executed. However, the legal and moral implications of such cooperation were complex. While his testimony aided the prosecution of other members of the organization, it also raised difficult questions about accountability, justice, and the nature of collaboration with former perpetrators of extreme violence. Despite these complexities, the broader trajectory of events was clear. The combination of public outrage, intensified state response, and internal disruption within Cosa Nostra led to a gradual weakening of the organization's power. The assassinations that were intended to assert dominance over the state instead became catalysts for its most aggressive anti-mafia campaign in modern history. Over time, arrests continued. Networks were dismantled. Financial structures were disrupted. Key figures within the organization were either captured, killed, or forced into hiding. Cosa Nostra did not disappear entirely, but its ability to operate with the same level of influence and impunity that it had enjoyed in earlier decades was significantly reduced. The legal consequences of the Capassi bombing and the subsequent wave of anti-mafia prosecutions extended far beyond individual convictions. They represented a structural shift in the relationship between the Italian state and organized crime. The strategy pioneered and advanced by Giovanni Falcone, treating mafia activity as a systemic criminal enterprise rather than isolated acts, became central to modern Italian anti-mafia jurisprudence. The idea that organized crime could be dismantled through coordinated legal and investigative action became an institutional framework rather than an experimental approach. In this sense, the legacy of the events that followed Capassi was not limited to arrests or trials. It reshaped the methodology of law enforcement itself. Yet beneath the legal outcomes remained a more human reality. The price of this transformation had been extraordinarily high. It had been paid in lives lost, families destroyed, and public servants who became targets simply for fulfilling their duties. Giovanni Falcone's assassination had been intended as the removal of a threat. Instead, it became the catalyst for one of the most extensive judicial responses to organized crime in European history. And in that response, the power of Cosa Nostra began to fracture in ways that even its leaders had not fully foreseen. The final phase of the conflict was not marked by a single decisive battle, but by a sustained campaign of arrests, prosecutions, and institutional restructuring. The war that began with surveillance on a Sicilian highway had now become a national reckoning. And the consequences of that reckoning would continue to shape Italy for decades to come. In the years following the Capaci massacre, Italy did not simply mourn Giovanni Falcone. It began to redefine the meaning of his life, his work, and the conflict that had led to his death. The explosion that destroyed a section of the A29 motorway on May 23, 1992, had taken only seconds to occur, but its consequences extended far beyond that moment, reshaping institutions, public consciousness, and the long struggle between the Italian state and Cosa Nostra. The immediate aftermath was marked by national grief. News of Falcone's death, along with Francesca Morvillo and the escort officers Antonio Montanaro, Vito Scafani, and Rocco DiCillo, spread rapidly across Italy. Television broadcasts were interrupted as journalists struggled to convey the scale of what had happened. For many Italians, the images from Capaci were difficult to comprehend. A highway torn open as if struck by a military bombardment, armored vehicles destroyed, and rescue teams moving through dust and debris in a landscape that resembled a war zone rather than a civilian roadway. Public reaction was not limited to shock. It quickly transformed into anger. In Palermo and other cities, citizens gathered in large numbers. Demonstrations emerged spontaneously, reflecting a collective sense that something fundamental had changed. The killing of Falcone was not perceived as an isolated act of violence. It was understood as an attack on the state itself, on the judicial system, and on the possibility of law enforcement standing against organized crime. This shift in perception proved crucial. For years, Cosa Nostra had operated within a climate where fear often limited open resistance. Violence existed, but it was frequently fragmented, localized, and difficult for the broader public to fully grasp. The Capaci bombing altered that dynamic. The scale and visibility of the attack removed ambiguity. The mafia was no longer an invisible presence operating in the background of society. It had become an overt adversary of the Italian state. The funerals of the victims became national events, broadcast across the country. They were moments of collective mourning that also carried a deeper political significance. They represented not only personal loss, but institutional failure and societal awakening. The presence of state officials, judges, police officers, and ordinary citizens reflected a unified acknowledgement that the victims had died in service of public duty. Among the most powerful images from this period were those of family members of the escort officers, particularly the emotional expressions of grief and anger that resonated with viewers throughout Italy. These moments became symbols of the human cost of the conflict and reinforced public determination that such violence should not be allowed to continue without consequence. In response to the assassinations of Falcone and, shortly after, Paolo Borsellino in the Via D'Amelio bombing, the Italian state initiated a far-reaching and sustained anti-mafia campaign. This campaign represented one of the most extensive law enforcement responses in the country's modern history. It was not a single operation, but a coordinated effort involving multiple branches of government, judiciary institutions, and police forces. The objectives were broad and ambitious. Authorities sought to dismantle the operational capabilities of Cosa Nostra, identify and arrest its leadership, disrupt its financial networks, and weaken its influence over territory and institutions. This required not only arrests, but also structural changes in investigative methods and legal frameworks. One of the most significant outcomes of this period was the acceleration of large-scale arrests, targeting mafia members across Sicily and beyond. Law enforcement operations intensified, supported by expanded intelligence gathering and improved coordination between agencies. Safe houses were discovered, communication networks were intercepted, financial trails were examined with increasing sophistication. The cumulative effect of these efforts placed significant pressure on the organizational structure of Cosa Nostra. While the organization had survived previous waves of repression, the post-Capasi response was more sustained and comprehensive than earlier efforts. It was driven not only by law enforcement necessity, but also by political urgency and public demand. A pivotal moment in this broader process occurred in January 1993 with the arrest of Salvatore Riina. Riina had been one of the most influential figures in Cosa Nostra, widely regarded as a central decision-maker during the period that included the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino. His capture after more than 2 decades as a fugitive marked a significant blow to the organization's leadership structure. Following his arrest, Riina faced multiple trials and received several life sentences. These convictions formally linked him to major acts of mafia violence, including the orchestration of high-profile assassinations. His removal from active leadership did not immediately eliminate Cosa Nostra, but it significantly disrupted its command hierarchy. Another key figure in the judicial aftermath of the Capasi massacre was Giovanni Brusca, who had played a direct operational role in the bombing. His arrest in 1996 added further clarity to the investigative understanding of the attack. Brusca's subsequent cooperation with authorities provided detailed confirmation of the planning, execution, and internal decision-making processes behind the assassination. His admissions helped establish how the operation had been organized, from surveillance of Falcone's travel patterns to the placement of explosives beneath the 829 motorway and the use of a remote detonation system. This testimony contributed to the broader judicial reconstruction of the events and reinforced the conclusion that the attack had been the result of coordinated planning at multiple levels within Cosa Nostra. The legal consequences of these developments extended beyond individual prosecutions. They contributed to a broader transformation in how Italy approached organized crime. The investigative model pioneered and developed by Giovanni Falcone, treating mafia activity as a structured, systemic enterprise rather than a series of isolated crimes, became deeply embedded in judicial practice. This approach emphasized financial investigation, organizational mapping, and long-term surveillance. It shifted focus from individual perpetrators to the networks that enabled criminal activity. Over time, this methodology became a defining feature of Italian anti-mafia strategy and influenced international approaches to organized crime as well. Despite these institutional successes, the human dimension of the Capasi massacre remained central to its legacy. The loss of Falcone, Morvillo, and the escort officers represented not only a legal or political event, but a profound personal tragedy. Their deaths underscored the vulnerability of those who confront organized crime and the risks inherent in defending legal institutions against violent opposition. Giovanni Falcone's legacy gradually evolved from that of a magistrate to that of a national symbol. He came to represent not only resistance to Cosa Nostra, but also the principle that organized crime could be confronted through law, evidence, and institutional persistence. His work demonstrated that even deeply entrenched criminal organizations could be challenged when approached as complex systems rather than fragmented threats. In recognition of this legacy, numerous institutions and public spaces were named in honor of Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Among the most prominent is the Palermo Airport, officially designated Falcone Borsellino Airport. Schools, public squares, and memorials across Italy also bear their names, serving as enduring reminders of their contributions and sacrifices. Each year, commemorations of the Capaci massacre continue to take place. These events are not solely acts of remembrance. They function as reflections on the broader struggle between organized crime and the state, and on the cost of that struggle. They also serve as reminders that the progress achieved in weakening Cosa Nostra was built upon significant sacrifice. From a historical perspective, the Capaci bombing is often regarded as one of the most significant mafia attacks in modern European history. Its scale, method, and political impact distinguish it from many other acts of organized crime violence. It demonstrated both the capacity of Cosa Nostra at its peak and the limits of violence as a strategy for maintaining power. In a profound irony, the assassination of Giovanni Falcone, intended to eliminate a perceived existential threat to the organization, became one of the catalysts for its long-term weakening. The public outrage that followed, combined with sustained state response, contributed to a period of intensified repression that significantly reduced the organization's influence over time. The final reflection on Capaci is therefore not only about destruction, but also about transformation. A highway was destroyed in seconds. Lives were lost in an instant. Yet the consequences of that moment extended into decades of legal reform, institutional change, and cultural memory. Giovanni Falcone's work did not end with his death. In many ways, it continued through the systems he helped shape, the investigations he influenced, and the legal principles that became central to Italy's fight against organized crime. The explosion at Capaci marked an end, but it also marked a beginning of a more determined response, a beginning of a more unified public stance against mafia violence, and a beginning of a legacy that continues to define Italy's understanding of justice, sacrifice, and the cost of confronting power rooted in fear. In the years and decades following the Capaci massacre, Italy entered a long period of reflection, reassessment, and institutional transformation shaped by the absence of Giovanni Falcone and the violent message left behind by Cosa Nostra. What began as an act of destruction on a Sicilian motorway gradually evolved into something far larger in national consciousness, a defining reference point for how a modern state confronts organized crime, how institutions respond to targeted political violence, and how societies remember those who fall in the line of duty. The explosion that killed Giovanni Falcone, along with Francesco Morvillo and his escort officers, did not end his influence. Instead, it marked the beginning of a legacy that expanded far beyond the courtroom in which he once worked. One of the most immediate and enduring consequences of Capaci was the transformation of Falcone from a magistrate into a national symbol. During his lifetime, Falcone had already been recognized within judicial circles as a leading figure in anti-mafia investigations, particularly for his role in treating Cosa Nostra as a structured criminal system rather than a collection of isolated offenders. However, after his death, public perception shifted dramatically. He became a figure representing not only legal expertise, but also moral resistance. His work was no longer viewed solely as professional duty. It became associated with sacrifice, institutional courage, and the cost of confronting entrenched criminal power. This symbolic transformation was reinforced by the parallel assassination of his close colleague, Paolo Borsellino, just weeks later in the Via d'Amelio bombing. Together, Falcone and Borsellino came to represent a unified narrative of judicial resistance against organized crime. Their names became inseparable in public memory, often invoked together in commemorations, educational programs, and institutional reforms. The proximity of their deaths created a sense that Cosa Nostra had declared open war not on individuals, but on the entire judicial framework of the Italian state. In response to these events, Italy's institutional identity underwent a significant shift. The state did not retreat under the pressure of violence. Instead, it expanded and intensified its anti-mafia strategy. The arrests that followed, including the capture of Salvatore Riina in 1993, demonstrated a renewed commitment to dismantling the leadership structure of Cosa Nostra. Riina's arrest, after more than 2 decades of evasion, was interpreted not simply as a tactical victory, but as a symbolic reversal of power. The man believed to have ordered some of the most violent attacks in modern Italian history was no longer beyond the reach of the state. The later arrest of Giovanni Brusca in 1996 added another layer to this evolving narrative. Brusca, who had directly participated in the Capacci operation and triggered the explosion that destroyed the motorway, later became a cooperating witness with authorities. His decision to collaborate provided investigators with detailed confirmation of how the attack had been planned and executed, reinforcing the judicial understanding of Cosa Nostra's internal decision-making processes during that period. His cooperation also highlighted one of the most complex moral dimensions of Italy's anti-mafia strategy: the reliance on insider testimony from individuals who had once committed extreme acts of violence. Beyond arrests and prosecutions, the legacy of Capacci deeply influenced Italian legal and investigative methodology. The approach developed by Falcone, treating organized crime as a systemic enterprise, became a foundational principle in modern anti-mafia jurisprudence. Instead of focusing solely on individual crimes or perpetrators, investigators increasingly examined financial flows, organizational hierarchies, communication networks, and long-term patterns of behavior. This systemic perspective allowed prosecutors to build more comprehensive cases and understand the broader structure supporting criminal activity. Over time, this methodology became institutionalized within Italian law enforcement and influenced international approaches to organized crime as well. The physical landscape of memory also changed significantly. Sites associated with Falcone and Borsellino were transformed into places of remembrance. The Palermo airport was renamed Falcone Borsellino Airport, embedding their legacy into the daily infrastructure of movement and travel. Schools, courthouses, public squares, and civic institutions across Italy were named in their honor. These acts of commemoration were not merely symbolic gestures. They functioned as continuous reminders of the cost of judicial independence and the importance of protecting those who uphold the law. Each year, on May 23rd, commemorations of the Capacci massacre are held across Italy. These events bring together students, judges, law enforcement officers, and citizens in acts of collective remembrance. The ceremonies often include moments of silence, educational discussions, and public readings that emphasize the values for which Falcone and his colleagues stood. Rather than fading into historical abstraction, the events of 1992 remain actively present in public life, reinforcing the idea that the struggle against organized crime is ongoing rather than concluded. At the societal level, Capacci contributed to a gradual but meaningful change in public attitudes toward Cosa Nostra. Prior to the early 1990s, fear and silence often shaped responses to mafia influence, particularly in regions where the organization held deep roots. After the assassinations, however, public expression of opposition became more visible and widespread. Citizens who had once remained silent began participating in demonstrations, educational initiatives, and civic movements aimed at confronting organized crime. The visibility of state response combined with the emotional impact of the killings helped shift the cultural environment in which mafia influence had previously operated. Despite these changes, the legacy of Capaci is not solely defined by institutional success or symbolic recognition. It is also defined by the permanence of loss. The deaths of Falcone, Morvillo, and the escort officers remain a reminder of a human cost associated with judicial work in environments where organized crime holds significant power. Their absence underscores the vulnerability of individuals who confront systems of violence and intimidation, even when supported by the state. Historically, the Capaci massacre is often described as one of the most audacious mafia attacks in modern European history. Its scale, precision, and political significance distinguish it from many other acts of organized crime violence. The use of approximately half a ton of explosives beneath a public highway demonstrated a level of operational capability that shocked not only Italy, but also international observers. Yet the long-term outcome of the attack revealed a profound strategic miscalculation on the part of Cosa Nostra. Rather than weakening the state, the assassination accelerated institutional reforms and intensified efforts to dismantle the organization itself. In this sense, the legacy of Capaci contains a central paradox. The attack succeeded in eliminating its intended target, but it failed in its broader strategic objective. Instead of silencing the anti-mafia movement, it amplified it. Instead of reinforcing the power of Cosa Nostra, it contributed to a sustained campaign of arrests, prosecutions, and structural weakening. The violence intended to assert dominance ultimately became a catalyst for institutional resistance. Today, the memory of Capaci continues to function as both warning and lesson. It serves as a reminder of how deeply organized crime can infiltrate societies, but also of how sustained legal, institutional, and public response can gradually erode even the most entrenched criminal structures. The story is not one of immediate resolution, but of long-term struggle, shaped by individuals who chose to confront danger through law rather than violence. At the center of that story remains Giovanni Falcone, whose work fundamentally altered the trajectory of Italy's fight against organized crime. His methods, his investigations, and his vision of systemic prosecution continue to influence judicial practice. His death transformed him into a symbol, but his life remains equally significant in understanding the evolution of anti-mafia strategy. The Capaci massacre, therefore, is not only remembered for what it destroyed, but for what it ultimately created: a strengthened legal framework, a more aware public, and an enduring commitment to confronting organized crime through institutional means. The motorway was rebuilt, the crater was filled, the physical scars were repaired, but the historical significance of that moment remains embedded in Italy's collective memory. And in that memory, the name Falcone continues to stand not as an endpoint, but as a beginning.